This is the Real Coaching Podcast. I'm Joel Filliol, high performance coach based in the UK and Spain, originally from Canada. And I've worked across several contexts in the Olympic space, as well as my international squad, JFT Crew, where the athletes have collectively achieved six World Triathlon Elite Championship titles via the World Triathlon Series. They've achieved over 100 World Championship Series podiums, including 33 World Series winners, spread over 9 different athletes. And we have had 19 overall podiums in addition to those winners, with the most recent one with Portuguese athlete Vasco Valacha, who finished third in the 2025 series. This is a new series of the podcast. The originals go all the way back to 2015 with Coach Paulo Souza, who was then co-hosting. And there's many classics there that are worth a re-listen. In my view, are really evergreen, as the fundamentals don't tend to change over time, despite new ideas coming around and around. So some of the classics are swim myth busting, training needs hierarchy, and the impact of scientific knowledge on coaching. So they'll be linked in the show notes. So last season's episodes, we had some great ones, optimizing bike fitting and aerodynamics with Matt Bottrell of the UK. And Matt and I went to the Silverstone Wind Tunnel last year, and we've done bike fits on a few athletes together. And it was a really interesting discussion on his views of aerodynamics and optimization. We spoke with Coach Gavin Smith of Loughborough University, who coached Cassandra Beaugrand to Paris Olympic gold, and his process, the build-up, learning points of her development in her time in Loughborough, and Gavin as a coach. Then we talked with Coach Fabio Restelli, Italian coach, but working a lot in France with French athletes, and was the coach of Léo Berger, who is a medalist also in the Paris Games. And again, fascinating discussion on the development of his Turbo Tri Squad, how he manages his process, his learnings, reflections from the Paris Olympics, and more. And we talked with Katie Zaferes, who was an athlete in the JFT Crew squad for many years and achieved both world champion and double Olympic medalist in Tokyo, and now her transition into coaching and her learnings in the early stages of building a squad. And we had a very popular episode with sports scientist Peter Leo called Rethinking Endurance Training. And we touched on strategic plans and culture in cycling. We touched on durability. It's a very popular concept that applies in cycling and certainly in triathlon, on the development of volume and intensity pre and post pandemic, and his observations, and his U23 cycling development study that generated a lot of insight into pathways to optimize development for young athletes. We talked with a colleague with the squad, Drew Box, on his experiences going from athlete to coach, how we have worked together in the squad over the last years, and how we've integrated our philosophy on continual learning and in the day-to-day daily training environment, and that we operate together in Spain. And the kickoff of last year was physiotherapy with Brad Beer, kickoff as a guest. And Brad is somebody I've worked with a long time, with a number of different athletes, both in Australia and remotely, and his experiences, injury management, prevention, and his insights to keep athletes healthy, which is obviously always the number one thing that we're aiming to do in athlete development. We've got to keep healthy. The actual kickoff was a shorter episode on coaching wisdom from last year's season, and it was a reflection on coaching philosophy and athlete management, the role of technology in coaching, and general wisdom, and how you apply experiences to knowledge. So that was a summary of where we were last year, and today is going to be about championship reflections, and both from a coaching process and an observation process in 2025, and I think really starting with where we see errors in big event preparation. And then we'll go on to championship notes, observations from the various events last year, and some commentary on the race ranger data that we've seen. So I think the first point I want to start with is really the most common error I see with championship performances, and there is a podcast I did on this topic where the main themes and common errors hold from back in 2020 pre-Tokyo Olympics, but the most common error I think is simply too high of a load too close to the race. And thanks to social media and Strava and otherwise, we see athletes doing a lot of big sessions and high load quite close to the championships or their goal event that we're talking about, and just pushing too hard, too close, and then unable to recover. And we see a lot of this has to do with searching for confidence. We're looking for evidence that we're on track or that we're going to perform well, and of course the irony there is in pursuing those type of sessions, we can undo our performance when it comes to race day, because we're just not able to recover, or we've spent too much energy on those big sessions. And when the best when the 4 to 6 weeks prior to a goal event, when I see too many PBs, too many medals in terms of 90-day or season or even all-time records in training, I always get a bit nervous about that. And if it happens as a result of just regular process, that's one thing. But if it's intentionally pursuing those kind of performances in training, that's where we might find we're undoing ourselves come race day, and we may not be able to access that level of performance come race day under the conditions that either a championship or goal race has. So the summary of that one is just too high of a load, too close to the race relative to the overall. And again, it requires ego control, self-discipline, and self-management to avoid searching for that confidence and then potentially self-sabotaging race day. Another point that we see often is just the overall season plan and periodization. And it's very common to see a gradual loss of conditioning and chronic load over the course of the season, either through race selection or training design or a combination thereof. We often see the chronic training load going down, and that's not necessarily a problem in itself, but it's in looking backwards over seasons where there's been underperformance. We can often find that the chronic load has gone down too much. The conditioning, the fitness has just degraded, and come the major event, we've just not got enough fitness in the bank to draw on to perform. And it comes to the previous point that many athletes' peak fitness is just achieved too early in the season, and that's often due to the density of high intensity training being too much too soon in the year, and then we struggle to maintain form as a result, as when that chronic load drops. And why does it drop? Well, often because we enter into a phase of either too much racing, too high density of competition, or we just can't maintain the higher intensity, and in order to maintain it, we try to reduce the training load and training volume, and that's fine in the short term, but too long periods of lower training load, the fitness is gonna go down. So, even right now at the time of recording, we're early in 2026. You can see a lot of athletes doing training that at a level that's probably not going to be sustainable over the course of the season. They're starting high intensity training too early, especially coming out of the off season. Essentially, your thresholds are going to be lower, and but of course, many athletes don't take that into account, so their relative intensity is even higher, and just starting to do hard work too soon, and it requires a kind of patience and again self management, ego control to start slow and build that foundation, and again, we just see that over and over as a pattern. It's very tempting to want to build confidence through high intensity work early, but it's perhaps not sustainable over the course of a season. Again, coming to this periodization concept. And of course, many athletes, they overestimate the amount of high intensity work that they need to achieve their best performance. So they're thinking they need more than they do, and it's very very common to end up in that space. The next point on championship performances is respecting travel and time zone and environment. Certainly with the grand final of World Triathlon in Wollongong in Australia, we saw a number of athletes, who are traveling from overseas. Australia's a long way from anywhere, and really getting into a level of work pretty quickly after arrival. And my experience, it just takes more time. It takes more. You have to respect the travel time zone shifts, and particularly around intensity. And we can see this in other events that require travel as well. People are traveling to 70.3 Worlds or Kona. It takes time to adapt to the environmental conditions. We've got to respect that. We need patience. And again, it's tempting to want to sort of validate your training in the new environment quickly after arrival. You want to show yourself that you're ready and confident, but again, these are the kind of things that can undo our championship performance, and is a high source of error. The next one is kind of a cross between psychology and physiology, and that's how we manage our expectations around championship performances. And find it's quite common before championships that athletes' performance expectations can shift, and particularly when the preparation has been good. See the above points, that the expectations can get out of connection with any kind of reality based on past performance. And there's the heuristic that the best predictor of future performance is past performance, and then that impacts the expectations we have, that they can get out of connection with the reality of where we are based on our past performances. And of course, we connect then to the hopes and dreams of what we think we can do after a great training block. But I think breakthroughs or significant changes in performance are relatively rare. It's often a gradual progression over time, not always linear. Sometimes performances don't reflect what we achieved in training. However, these expectations can be a problem because, of course, during competitions, we can find ourselves, struggling or failing to deal with how the race is actually going, even if how it's going is well grounded in previous performances, but perhaps not going as well as the hopes and dreams had built up. So we can end up athletes with a negative spiral during races, and a loss of perspective then, when those performances don't match the reality based on their development. Higher expectations, of course, can positively impact performances, particularly around sort of tactics and sometimes taking a risk that can make sense in terms of how to approach races, or putting yourself in the right position. If you're confident and positive, you're going to do that. But I certainly see expectations going out of control often has a negative impact. So I think staying grounded and rational about what the next step in performance is, and not trying to skip steps in terms of expectations. And finally, the last point that I reflected on this year, thinking about championships, was just simply tapering. Always come back to tapering as a key one that's easy to get wrong. And, again, the most common issue, feeling flat, having not done enough intensity in the final week or days prior to the race, due to feeling the fear of feeling tired come race day. And it's a tricky one. It crosses physiology, psychology. You've got to be confident to do enough to stay activated, to stay open, so you don't feel flat. And of course, it's connected to the training load, the chronic load before you arrive at race week. Again, see the previous points of having either done too much in the immediate block before goal races, and then feeling like you need that recovery on race week and into race day. And I've certainly got the timing wrong many times in the past with this timing of the drop down in load and making sure the training is absorbed. But it remains a consistent point to come back to of how we manage the taper. And I think the main takeaway point is needing to do enough to maintain intensity race week, so that we're able to access that and we don't end up in this kind of over recovered state and feeling flat, which again is just so common. So those are summary of some errors in preparation, certain that I've made, that I've observed, and I've observed in others based on this year. So some reflections on championships. Again, alluded to at the outset. We can start with Wollongong, the grand final for the World Triathlon Series, and I'm certainly delighted with Vasco's performance in his third place, and a solid grand final performance, which is what we've been trying to unlock the last couple of years. And again, the interesting thing about the World Series is just the consistency that's required across the events. And you could get into the pros and cons of when there used to be a one-day championship versus a series. But what I like about the series is the degree that your process and execution has to be just to such a high level across either 4 or 5 races across the season. Performance delivery, decision making. I mean, there's just so many points where things could go wrong. So it really rewards those who have managed the bigger picture well, which I find as a coaching challenge, as an athlete challenge, super engaging to try to figure that out. And of course, with the depth of competition in World Triathlon Series racing, you really can't be too far off the podium across the whole season if you want to have a shot at being world champion. And we saw with certainly the men's world champion in Matt Hauser, basically a perfect season was required to win. One of the interesting things in Wollongong was sort of the last-minute swim course change. The original course was two laps out and back from a beach start, and the end of the lap, or the far end of the lap, was sort of due to go out into past the breakwater of this harbor, and I guess it was deemed to be too wavy, so they changed the course to sort of this, I don't know, U shape or W shape, depending how we think about it, with many more turns per lap, and that had a significant impact in on the race when they saw breakaways, both the men and women, which is not usual in itself. But I think the insight here is how much the turns in open water swim racing, how much gap comes from the turns, and therefore the bigger gaps as a result of having more turns, more buoys to turn around during the race. And we can see this also in the smaller fields in the T100 races, which have a max of 20 athletes, and in general, and you end up having quite compacted fields compared to what you would expect for, slightly longer distances relative to standard distance. And I was speaking with former squad athlete Jelle Geens at one of the T100 races, and he remarked how his pool times haven't really changed too much compared to the past, pool training times. But now, he sort of joked, now he's a front pack swimmer in T100, and it just shows a little bit how the different dynamics impact so much the race. In that case, the smaller field size means there's less fighting, less congestion around the buoys, and of course the dynamics are that the better swimmers don't work as hard as they do in short distance racing to create those gaps. But just an interesting reflection on the dynamics of the race and the impacts of the turns and the course. Of course, in Wollongong, the big talking point was both Cassandra Beaugrand and Beth Potter having unusual performances, in the sense that in the sense of Cassandra ultimately dropping out and having a really off day, an uncharacteristic off day, and similar Potter fading on the run, which is typically her strength, and opening the door for Lisa Turch to come through with the world title. So that was quite unexpected. But then we saw that in some other racing this year too. And I guess it shows to some degree championship performances are about simply reproducing what you have done before, and consistently before in racing. And we often can think about championships you need a peak performance, but my experience, it's often actually not the case. You don't need to be better than you have been before. You just have to do what you have done before, under the higher stress conditions of a championship or a big goal race. And obviously in that case, that didn't happen for those two athletes. So there'd be some reflections there. Another interesting thing from Wollongong is earlier in 2025, World Triathlon announced that the racing suits could now include sleeves, like they do in middle distance racing. And I was thinking through this season, who are we going to see that comes up with suits with sleeves? And again, we're assuming here that like middle distance racing, long distance, and of course cycling, there's been big developments in materials, the fabrics, the design of the fabrics with either under layers or the texture of the suits that make them faster aerodynamically. So we haven't seen too much of that until the very end of the year, when British Triathlon had a suit with sleeves that Jess Fulgar wore. Not everyone wore, not all the British athletes wore that suit, but certainly interesting that eventually emerged a long sleeve suit. And of course, with the long sleeve suits, the issue is always, are they going to be swimmable, because they have to be tight enough to be hydrodynamic in the water. But also then, do those same materials, allow to be more aerodynamic on the bikes? So I'm sure we'll see more innovation and testing in this space. Also in Wollongong, we had because it was a wetsuit, that also wetsuit swim, that also changes a little bit because you can have a more loose swimsuit than you might when it's a non-wetsuit. So we did see some athletes as well, I think from Austria, wearing an undershirt underneath their regular race suit, textured under layer. That potentially could help with aerodynamics. So we will see how that evolves. So many of World Triathlon countries are using the same supplier in 0D, who must not have a sleeve suit yet, but of course I expect that will become more standard over time. Although we still see athletes racing in suits, at least on the women's side, without legs, and we know legged suits are hydrodynamically faster, most likely aerodynamically faster, and yet still not everyone chooses those. So it may be that not everyone is using sleeve suits, but I expect to become more normalized in the build up to LA. So that was Wollongong. Nice, it was an interesting race. The last championship outside of Kona before they both men's and women's go back to Kona next year. And I suppose the inside of the notable how close the lead group really came off the bike together, meaning that the challenging bike course didn't separate the contenders too much. Much like 70.3 Worlds. I think the long downhills and the end of the Nice course also contribute to that. But and then just the speed on the run. Again, anytime we're outside the Kona type conditions at championship level in full distance, we're seeing some very fast runs. In small part or in no small part due to super shoes, of course, but also the environmental conditions just make such a difference. And it's kind of a shame that, on one hand, that we don't continue to have a rotating championship outside of Kona, but on the other hand, it's Kona's history of Kona is such an important part of the triathlon narrative that very attractive to go back. And continue that legacy there. In Kona itself, with the women's championship, like Wollongong, we saw two of the main favorites late in the race needing to stop, and DNF nib very late in the race, and Lucy Charles Barclay a bit earlier. And the weather conditions in Kona. Obviously, it's always hot and humid, but it varies. You can get very hot years, very windy years, and other years where slightly cooler, less windy. And I think it's a reminder that full distance, but in particular in Kona, is still a race of self versus self, of individuals, and pacing and self-discipline are paramount to having your best race. And it's tempting to want to race others at various points. We see it often in the bike, over biking, and then be really struggling on the run, or in the case of these athletes, perhaps getting caught up in the race between each other, and not recognizing the signs to slow down early. There's all kinds of different reasons, but I think the insight there is coming back to the history of the island and how challenging those conditions are to race in, very unforgiving. Should we go over the edge, like we saw there so many times. Great race in Kona needs to have something in reserve for once you get up Palani Hill and out to the energy lab on the run, and that you could say the race really starts there. So that was interesting, and not a new reflection, but interesting to see how it played out. Other championships, Toulouse, we had the Super Tri final. Some different dynamics here. We had it's a very tight course in Toulouse. We had There's always an impact of the motos there, which I'll come on to later. Given the tight nature of the course and super tri racing, we had kind of significant impacts of teamwork, which is understandable. Part of super tri prize money is distributed by the team ranking. It's as much or more than the individual performances. And then the short shoots have had an impact through the season. I'm not a fan of these and kind of the distortion they have on racing. I don't think we need kind of gimmicks in triathlon like that. But it was a different season for the Super Tri with fewer, I would say, of the main contenders from the World Series who traditionally have raced Super Tri. It's always a difficult with scheduling conflicts, the opportunity cost. Very difficult to race everything to the same level, and so we saw some of that this year. 2026 with Super Tri, it looks like some changes are coming to the format. The calendar, we'll see where it goes in terms of the teams and those dynamics, but it will be something new for Super Tri in 2026. Next one was Qatar, the T100 Grand Final. There wasn't kind of too many performances that were surprising at all, but just again highlighting racing in the Middle East. The environmental conditions are tough, and in particular, having the final so late in the year also is a big challenge for all the reasons we discussed on the outset of timing, of periodization, arriving in December with energy to spare after racing. For some of these athletes since March, April, it's a long year. It's hard to manage. Obviously, the champions got it right, but it's just interesting to reflect on length of the season, and as Qatar will be hosting the T100 final for the next couple of years, it's going to be an ongoing issue to solve for the performance puzzle. The next one that's been interesting this year that I was reflecting on has been the Race Ranger and the data that's been publicized. Starting with Roth. So I was at Roth at the athlete meeting when this idea was brought up to make the data public, and it's been interesting to see because while Race Ranger has been used for a number of years, it's not been released publicly before this year, and just despite what a lot of people comment on, I've found the amount of draft zone time relatively low. I don't think maybe it's on T100 or short distance races, between 1 and 3 or 4 minutes, or even 0. These are not significant portions of the race for the most part. So that tells us there's not a lot of drafting with the current draft zone that they're using, and that scales up. Even Roth. If you're on the bike for 4 hours, and if there's only less handful of minutes, this is not significantly impacting the results. So one of the things, then you think about if this is going to be public, what is the accuracy? First, I was thinking it was GPS, but it's not. It's ultra wideband technology, which those who have perhaps an iPhone with Find My Devices, uses the same. If you've got a key ring with an AirTag on it, you can use ultra wideband to find it. So it's got reportedly very good accuracy. But still, it's got to be tricky for the algorithm to figure out two objects moving at speed. It's not necessarily a stationary device that you're looking for. So I'm sure that the Race Ranger team has worked hard to get that accurate. But anytime anything is public like that and is used, the end result is often pylons or criticism of people. You'd hope that the accuracy is good enough. But the other reflection was that the data is not raw data, actually, but it's edited to remove parts of the course, like Internet of Transitions or corners. Certainly we see a ton of corners in T100 races. with the courses this year. Hills where athletes may compress, where drifting out of the draft zone into the draft zone may be unavoidable. And my reflection here is that I'm not sure it's necessary to have that edited data. Obviously, it reduces the time in draft zone in the final report, but there's any editing has the possibility to introduce bias, and I think we should just have raw data. And if athletes are within the draft zone in corners, well, that's draft time, even if it's unavoidable or not technically against the rules in those moments. Better just to have it, I think, and let it tell its own story. And the higher the density of competitors, it's going to have more drafting time, even if those are allowed in a sense. It often brings sort of the next point is this ongoing sort of dialogue about 12 meters versus 20 meters. There's still some draft effect, of course, beyond 12 meters. We know that. The issue is just field size and congestion, I think, with regards to that. So obviously, 20 meters is better from a fair point of view, but you probably have to reduce the field size if you're going to do that. And just because there's just not enough space on the course. I was at the transition 1 at 70.3 Worlds, and you just watch the density of athletes going out. And when athletes are racing, of course, they're racing there, but there's not enough space on the course. If you've got 60 plus athletes starting, you're not going to be able to spread everyone out on the course. According to a bigger space. I mean, it's an issue even with 12 meters, but smaller fields are part of that. But there's other downsides to smaller fields. But I often feel like these discussions about draft zone, it ends up kind of a bit like ego points of people who consider themselves better bikers, and I think versus sort of ones who are runners. And I don't think there's too many athletes that set out to actually draft intentionally. But I think it brings to the wider issue that, coming back to some of the races we saw this year where, the best athletes are the ones who cross the finish line first, obviously, but they're strong across all three disciplines. So I think the best biker, from a bike split point of view, it doesn't tell you whether they just overbike to go for a fast bike split because of ego or sponsors or otherwise. You've got to measure that at the finish line of the race, not just position off the bike. There's lots of people who consider themselves bikers who just overbike and then they don't run as well as they could as a result of the pacing issue. And likewise, many better runners, they're more conservative on bike pacing, and that allows them to express their best run on the course. So I think it's a little oversimplification to think about how we think about who are the best bikers and best runners. And I mean, that's the beauty of triathlon, is that you've got to be good across all three. And as the sport has evolved in middle and long distance, I mean, you really just can't have a significant weakness in any of the three. And the final reflection on this is, and I raised this and thought about it in Roth when this was introduced, but well, what about the impact of motos on the on drafting, and can we get a race ranger on all the motos so we know how much time is being spent in the draft zone of motos? And these have a significant influence on races. There's been lots of dialogue in cycling about this over the years, plenty of times in triathlon, in all duration, in all formats, and can have a significant impact of the race. And at this point, it's unknown how much that is. So now we're seeing between athletes, but But frankly, I'm more concerned about time behind motos. And, anytime we're watching an image of an athlete on the bike from the front, there's a pretty good chance that the athlete may be getting assistance from that moto. Motos are bigger than bikes, bigger than riders. There's a lot of draft behind them. They're often constantly moving from the side to the front, trying to get images. Of course, we want good images of the races, and so we accept that there are motos around the front of the race typically, and that's the thing, is it often impacts the front more than otherwise. And we also know that the athletes themselves don't control the positions of where the motos are. So it's not necessarily that they're seeking out to be behind the motos, or they can't control it where they go. However, they can also benefit, and I think it would be interesting to see if we were able to see data from that and what impact they're having. And there was one quite egregious example of this, and again, it's not the athlete's fault, but we saw in Barcelona, the Challenge Barcelona, that there was really significant motos in front of the race, in front of the lead athlete, and it must have had some impact on the race. Again, we can't know how much, but it would be, with the ability of the race ranger to measure that, it would be good to add it to the data that we have. So that's the reflections of this year. I've got some plans for next episodes in terms of season planning, periodization, expanding on some of the points we started with. And I'll close off with, of course, a lot of my work is with high performance or elite athletes. The ideal athlete that I'm looking for is highly ambitious, experienced, who want the best possible guidance to improve their performances. So those who I typically work with have either gotten stuck or reached a performance plateau, struggling to escape from some kind of injury or underperformance. So coaching is available, or as an alternative to one-to-one coaching, consultation, a review of programming, a review of periodization. That's also possible, and equally the same with coaches. Coaches can receive support or mentorship and guidance, perhaps a second set of eyes on their coaching practice. So that's all for this one. If you've reached the end, thanks for listening. Let me know questions, comments from what you've heard today, and share it with somebody that you think may benefit. Bye for now.